You are entering Nick and Melo's hyperspace.
Hello, I'm Carmelo, and my favorite legacy is the legacy of the Jedi.
Carmelo, I have to disagree. My name is Nick. I believe the Jedi have left behind a complicated legacy.
In our journey through hyperspace, we examine everything and anything Star Wars from the point of view of two lifelong fans, one young, one old, who came together through the will of the Force.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about legacy in general, how that relates to the narrative itself, the creators, and the fans. I guess before we begin, Carmelo, I think we need to define what legacy means to us. So, what does legacy look like for you?
Well, to me, the idea of legacy is very much connected to the idea of generations, of sort of passing on a legacy, passing on a story, passing on an idea. And so one of the things that I love about Star Wars is, as you mentioned, that it's sort of happening at many different levels. It's happening within the story. It's happening in the world of the creators, but it's also happening with the fans, both as consumers of Star Wars and as creators of Star Wars. And so I love the idea of legacy because it's it's pretty much everywhere in the idea in the world of Star Wars or in the worlds of Star Wars. How do you think of legacy, Nick?
Yeah, I view it in a very similar fashion. I think it's very integral a part of Star Wars. It's something that I think will probably always be there. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And it's one of those things where it influences a lot of Star Wars when it comes to story decisions for the creators and for the characters in universe. It
can you think of an example of that?
Well, I would look at I'll say Kylo Ren, for example. He is very much influenced by his grandfather. Wants to carry on that legacy of the Empire, the old way of how things used to be. You see that a lot with the Jedi and Sith. They are constantly going back and forth with that. And you look at it too with some of the decisions that the underworld makes. They live by a code, even though they do some very shady things. They have an honor and a way of doing things, and that's just kind of how it's always been. And nobody really questions it. They just kind of go with it. You know?
Right. It's interesting that you mentioned Kylo Ren because you mentioned that, and all of a sudden I went back to the very beginning of Luke Skywalker, where he doesn't really have a legacy of the Jedi because he doesn't know about it. He's heard about the Jedi, but he doesn't know anything about it. And so I think one of the sort of magical things about that character is that he is entering a world in which he will slowly learn about the Jedi. In the same way that the audiences, when they watch the movie for the first time, are sort of like, who the hell are the Jedi? Yeah. And so it's really interesting that in the case of Kylo Ren, we have this long legacy of what the Jedi are and what the Force is. And in the case of Luke Skywalker, this is completely new inside the story and outside the story. When we get to the sequel trilogy, everybody knows what the Jedi are.
Right.
And everybody knows what the Force is. And everybody knows what the dark side of the Force is.
And who Luke Skywalker is.
Luke doesn't know shit. He's just a farm boy who really likes flying. And so it's interesting to see what happens when you have that legacy, in the case of Kylo Ren, and what happens when you don't have a legacy, in the case of Luke Skywalker. So I had a question for you about sort of the underworld and the bounty hunters. Because for me, that world is so connected to the idea of tricking and treason and changing the rules. And I'm curious about how you see a notion of legacy in a world that is constantly breaking the law, breaking the code, breaking the rules.
Yeah, well, I think there have been a couple of good examples in Solo. You hear Beckett, he's kind of the mentor character for Han in a lot of ways, even though he ends up on the wrong side of the battle. But he teaches Han an important lesson that you don't trust anyone. And I think that's something that sadly that the underworld just constantly deals with. And that's kind of I guess it's not like it's kind of those unwritten rules of the underworld. You don't see a lot of them they're not really good buddies and they don't hang out. And I mean, they have drinks, but it's
No.
usually when they're on a job. And when you look at the Mandalorians, are very much integrated in the underworld and with the huts and things like that. And they have a code, which is depending on which, I guess, version of Mandalore or the Mandalorians you want to follow. Some are stricter than others. They have a really good sense of honor.
And in many ways, Mando himself, Din Djarin, is sort of a very righteous bounty hunter, which is sort of unique in that world. And I'm really, really curious to see what happens with the Book of Boba Fett, because we've seen a Boba Fett that is sort of following the code of, you gave me back my armor, I'm going to help you, Mando. But let's see, once he's done helping Mando,
right,
what kind of Boba Fett we're going to get. And so there's once again this sort of really interesting way in which different characters absorb or adapt the idea of legacy from what came before and what's going to go through it. And so that I find really interesting.
Yeah. So you brought up a interesting point earlier about the Jedi. Talk about what do you think of their legacy? You said in the intro you think they leave a great legacy, and I differ with you a little bit, even though I love the Jedi, as you could tell. But
right.
What do you think about the Jedi in terms of their place in the universe and what kind of legacy they've left?
I think well, the first thing I want to say is that I think I personally always separate the Jedi Order, the sort of organized system that exists in the galaxy, and Jedi themselves. And so to me, there is a legacy that comes from individual Jedi. And I think there's a different legacy that comes from the Jedi Order itself. And so I am very attracted to the sort of individual legacies that different Jedi have left, like the legacy of Qui-Gon or the legacy of Kenobi. Or if we go back to Legends, the fascinating legacy of Revan. And so it's really interesting. That's what I'm really intrigued by. I am much more conflicted about the sort of organized Jedi society of the Jedi Order, because, and we can talk about this in a different podcast, because there is a conflict of interest between what the Jedi stand for and the function of the Jedi in the galaxy. And to me, that's different, which is fascinating with the High Republic, because it'll be interesting to see how that develops at a time that is so far remote from what we are used to, that the function of the Jedi as an order might be different from the function of the Jedi as an order during the prequel, the original trilogy, and the sequel trilogy. Now, you had issues with the Jedi, so I can't wait to hear this.
And honestly, hearing that explanation from you, we actually kind of are similar. I love certain Jedi, and I think they're incredible characters and really kind of embody what a Jedi should be. But that the Order itself is kind of problematic, to say the least. And I think it's interesting because when you were talking about the High Republic, it made me think about just the films for a second. And outside of the prequels in the films, there's really not a lot of Jedi running around.
No,
we don't see many. They're more mythological, and and even during the original trilogy and even some of the sequels, a lot of people aren't sure that they even exist or that they're real. So it builds on that myth. And like Luke said, that they're the all-powerful Jedi Order that everyone thinks are kind of these godlike beings, and and we see constantly over and over through creators and multiple different stories that they're human in a lot of ways, even if they're biologically human. They make mistakes, and that's kind of where I differ from the Order, is that they're kind of too stoic and too unforgiving at times. And it you know, after a while I could see how that is complicated to be a part of. Do you really? And I think we've seen it a little bit in the High Republic with the characters kind of questioning, like, what are we doing here, you know?
Yeah, because to me, what I love about the Jedi Legacy, it's not the fact that they turn into an order, or that there's an ethics to the Jedi, and that I find really, really intriguing. And you know, we could get into in the fandom. There's this sort of like, you know, are you fascinated by the Jedi or the Sith? And there's this really large conversation that happens all the time about the dark side and the light side, and the sort of the faults and the errors of the Jedi Order and all of that. But to me, it boils down to ethics. To me, it boils down to ethics, and so that I find I'm infinitely more attracted to the idea of the Jedi than I am to the idea of the Sith. But that's just me. And one of the things that I love about Star Wars is that there are all of these routes that you can go to arrive at certain sort of elements of Star Wars, and so that's really, really fun.
Yeah, I think that fans a lot of the times, and we love the lightsaber duels and the cool different variations of lightsabers we have. But yeah, I think a lot of times that gets kind of lost in the philosophy and the teachings of both the Jedi and the Sith. Somebody might like red over blue, but you know, I'm kind of with you with the Jedi philosophy is fascinating to me, and it's kind of like real world religion. Don't want to get too religious, but you know, a lot of times religions are twisted to fit, you know, whatever is going on currently and whatever needs to be done or what should be done, they believe. And I think that's kind of maybe Lucas's intent through the prequels and through the Clone Wars was kind of showing you that, like, this isn't really how they should be acting. This is not historically how they do act, and they're in an extreme situation.
I think the stories are very clearly on the side of the Jedi, even if they made all those mistakes. I don't think the prequel is saying happily ever after we live with the Sith. They're not saying that. But I think it's interesting. I have a friend that says, you know, they're baddies, but they have the coolest costumes. There's something really attractive about the Sith, regardless of its ethics. And so it's really it's yet another legacy that Star Wars has that a lot of people are attracted to, because there's something very badass about the Sith. Sometimes they might be evil, but they know their shit, and they do it really well. They're very good at being bad.
If you look at their philosophies and their, you know, code, I don't know the code off my head. I'm not that, I don't have it memorized, but you know, I know it's it doesn't sound to me anyway. It doesn't sound like it's a very negative thing.
Which one?
Their code, the Sith code. It's very, you know, and I think a lot of people. I think some parts of it. I think some people relate to it, and it doesn't. You know, it doesn't seem. I guess what I'm getting at is people kind of could view, and maybe this is Lucas's intent when creating the Sith. We could see ourselves becoming Sith just as easily as we can Jedi, and that's why there's such a two of the same coin kind of analogy.
Right.
There's a very fine line between the two.
Right.
I think that's really interesting.
That's the magic of Vader. I mean, that's the internal conflict of Vader, and this is why it's one of the things why the prequels trilogy is so interesting, because we get to see the details of that fine line, as you call it, between the light and the dark. That there are certain things that you do for very good intentions that end up being really, really, really bad.
Right. And we see that in Star Wars. I think that light versus dark is always going to be the constant conflict. You know, even if it's bounty hunter versus bounty hunter, there's going to be a good angle and a bad angle that we're going to look at. And if it's the rebellion versus some evil government, it's always going to be the light and dark conflict, and that to me is the legacy of Star Wars. It is the classic good versus evil, no matter what kind of aspect or angle you take at it.
And I'm going to add to that, because I find it that I think the legacy of Star Wars started like that, good versus bad, but I think it has slowly, and I think carefully, moved into the sort of complication of the light versus dark, the good versus bad. And I think it starts with the prequels, and then it moves into the television shows. Because I think both Clone Wars and Rebels are constantly thinking a little deeper about the dichotomy of light versus dark.
So Carmelo, I guess I have a couple questions I want to ask you as we're wrapping up here. So what do you think are some downsides to legacy when it comes to Star Wars? And when I say that, I mean, how do you think legacy in universe affects characters and the way the story is told? Is there a downside to that?
That's an interesting question. I don't know that there is necessarily a downside. I think the way that Star Wars deals with legacy is sort of very much related to what we talked at the beginning of our podcast about the idea that there's going to be certain characters that are heavily influenced by a legacy. And there are going to be other characters that don't have a legacy, and slowly acquire that legacy. But I think you're right, Nick. I think that Star Wars depends on legacy for its storytelling. And I think the fans enjoy the idea of legacy because it creates a history, it creates a past. And so it's not, Star Wars is always about what came before. Remember, it's a galaxy far, far away, a long time ago. So from the very beginning, there's this sort of idea that there is a past that influences us, whether it's the past of the Jedi, whether it's the past of my dad used to watch Star Wars, so I'm watching it now, whether it's the past of Filoni watching the movies when he was a kid and then growing up and becoming a filmmaker. I think the world of Star Wars inside the narrative and outside the narrative depend on legacy. I think it's part of the genetic pool in the way that it. That's just the way I think about it. That's just the way I think about it. Do you see a downside to legacy?
I think in universe, I don't think so as much so as outside of when it comes to writers and directors and the creators on board. I don't think.
Yeah.
I think that becomes problematic because, as we've seen, some cases when if you try new things or things that are unorthodox, I guess you could say, to Star Wars, it kind of creates a tension in the fan base. And that leads to my next question. Do you think it's important to is legacy important to keep Star Wars relevant in the pop culture and into the mainstream media?
Well, I think it's convenient because by having that legacy, you keep the fire burning. But I like very much what you're saying, that sometimes this idea of legacy blocks the idea of seeing new ways of telling the story of Star Wars. I don't care. I know that there's huge fights out there about The Last Jedi, but The Last Jedi is an excellent example of something that is trying to break away from a lot of expectations about the legacy of the Jedi and Star Wars and storytelling and women in Star Wars and men in Star Wars. And I think part of the magic of that movie is that my jaw kept dropping all the time because it kept changing my expectations. And I found that super interesting.
Yeah.
I think the internal conflict of Luke Skywalker in that movie is amazing.
Right.
And so I think you have a really good point that sometimes that notion of legacy tends to limit us to what we can do with Star Wars. And so maybe it's the tension of having a legacy and tweaking that legacy. And maybe we need to come to that balance, both inside the world and outside the world, of seeing Star Wars changing while at the same time keeping sort of a lifeline to the legacy. And I think that's a lovely way of thinking about it.
I think like I said earlier, there's a balance or a fine line between light and the dark side, and it's kind of a similar way in a meta sense.
Absolutely.
You want to honor creators that came before you, and especially Mr. Lucas, but you really want to kind of carve your own path and make something that is uniquely yours in this big sandbox that was created. And we'll see, I guess, where it goes. It'll be interesting to see the next few years with all these shows coming up to Disney Plus. So
absolutely. This was fun.
Yeah, it was. Guys, we are about out of time today, but thanks for sitting with us. And we're about to exit hyperspace. So we will talk to you on our next destination journey, and have a good one. Thank you, guys.
Bye.